You good?
All right, here we go. All right, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here today. My name is Jason Croyner. I'm from the University School. It's spring break for many of us, and wow, what a difference a month has meant. And we've spent time realizing now with people not being able to leave homes that we needed to get some content so that people could see and learn things. And so this week we've had how to make pop-up cards. We've had what's the economic forecast impact of coronavirus. And we're here today with Nick Delong. This is part of a partnership with the Charleston Area Convention and Visitors Bureau to try to spotlight some of the really cool things that are going on in the Charleston area, so you can see, even when we're all locked up at home, what really neat things are happening here in Charleston. So when the day comes, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later, we can go see these things for ourselves. So this is sort of to whet your appetite, sort of prepare you before you go on a field trip, because I'm in Mount Pleasant, maybe 2 miles from the bridge. I think I could get to where the Friends of the Hunley and all that stuff is in like 15 minutes. It's not a very far drive at all. So I'm going to pass this on to Nick Delong, who's an underwater archaeologist, essentially. Thank you, Nick, for being here today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be able to teach about the Hunley and all the work that we do at the Warren Lasch Conservation Center, even while we're all kind of locked up at home. So just to give you a little bit of background about myself. So like we said, my name is Nick Delong. I'm a maritime archaeologist or underwater archaeologist, and I work at the Warren Lasch Conservation Center. So a little bit of information about the Warren Lasch Conservation Center. We're actually part of Clemson, so I'm a Clemson employee. So we work for Clemson University, and we're located in North Charleston on the old Navy base. So it's kind of Clemson University's satellite campus here in the Lowcountry, which is really great. So I will go ahead and I have a PowerPoint prepared for everyone. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what the Warren Lasch Conservation Center does, and then our work on the H.L. Hunley submarine. So just before I start, I'll give you a little bit of background information about me and what exactly it is that I do. So I originally got a bachelor's degree in history. And then after that, I decided I wanted to get into underwater archaeology. I thought that sounded really cool. It was a way of studying history with my hands and combine my passion for history with scuba diving. So that was one of the things that I really loved to do growing up. And that's what I decided was my path. So I went to East Carolina University to get a master's degree in maritime studies, and specifically maritime archaeology. And from there, I've worked a couple different places, but ended up at the Warren Lasch Conservation Center, where I get to do some really amazing things. So I'm going to go ahead and get the PowerPoint started. Make sure this is all working.
And Nick, if I need to change a setting, I'm ready to hit.
Gotcha. All right, could everybody see the PowerPoint? Got it? Fantastic. All right, so let's talk about the H.L. Hunley Conservation and Archaeology that is conducted at the Warren Lasch Conservation Center right here in the Lowcountry in North Charleston. So for starters, I want to talk about the amazing people that actually work at the Warren Lasch. We have an incredible group of both conservators and archaeologists, as well as historic preservation specialists, and a group of wonderful researchers that all work together to one, our main goal has been the study and conservation of the H.L. Hunley submarine. But we also do a lot of other stuff, including historic preservation. So historic preservation is understanding and studying the built environment. So buildings and, understanding the history of the community and what we, where we live and things like that. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm one of the archaeologists. And before I get into the history of the H.L. Hunley submarine, I want to talk a little bit about the conservation, because this is one of the most important aspects about being able to study archaeology and get that information out to the public. So one of the things that we have to do is conserve the objects that we actually recover and excavate. And for us, the biggest one is the Hunley submarine itself. So you can see a picture of it right here. This is where it currently lives inside of our tank. So we try and keep it submerged in water as much as possible, although we do drain the tank so that we can actually get down there and work on it. But for the most part, it sits in this tank submerged in liquid. So the 3 steps of conservation that I want to explain that are conducted on the Hunley itself are cathodic protection, deconcretion, and desalination. So for starters, we have cathodic protection. So cathodic protection is essentially introducing an electronic current and sacrificial metals into the system, so into the Hunley itself, and we use that combination of electrical current and sacrificial metals to actually take place. So the rather than the Hunley becoming corroded, all of that actually is focused on those sacrificial metals. So those are going to get corroded instead of the metal itself. We call those sacrificial anodes. It's really interesting. Actually, you'll find them on most boats that you see. There'll be a tiny spot of a little piece of iron that actually absorbs all of that corrosion to help keep the metal on the boat safe. And then we have deconcretion. So the deconcretion is actually the physical removal of a concretion layer that gets built up on the iron itself. So this material happens when you introduce microorganisms in the salt water to the iron over a long period of time. So it's essentially like a concrete layer. It's actually physical. It can be a couple of millimeters or a couple of centimeters thick in some places. And what we actually do is we physically remove those using tools, oftentimes the same ones that you'd find in a dentist office. So chisels, little electric drills, and we have to go through and physically remove all of that concretion layer. And you can see the difference right here, where you have a spot of concretion compared to the actual metal underneath. And that's what our goal is, to actually get to that metal. You can see the difference right here again, that concretion layer over top, almost like I said, kind of a concrete layer. And one of the most important reasons for doing this is now that we can get down to the actual layer of metal, we can better understand and study what's actually happening, or what is actually used on the Hunley itself. So for instance, right here, this is a part of the gearing mechanism on the HL Hunley. And we weren't able to actually see that prior to deconcretion. So this really shows the importance of this step in our ability to study the submarine itself. And then finally, moving on to desalination. So one of the interesting things about iron is it's really porous. So a lot of us have probably seen or used a cast iron skillet like we have at home. And one of the things that we do is we season that cast iron skillet so it absorbs salt and oil to make all that food taste so good. But all iron kind of does that. But what happens when the submarine itself, or a piece of iron, goes into salt water for hundreds of years, well, it's going to absorb all of those salts and chlorides from the ocean because it's salt water. So as the iron itself absorbs that, if you were to take that out of the water, all of those salts would still be in there, but the water would evaporate, and then you'd be left with just salt in the iron, and then you would end up where it would completely almost disintegrate or turn into dust. And we don't want that, because this is the only example of the Hunley that we have, so we have to take care of it. So what we do is we desalinate it. So we try and remove all of those salts and chlorides from the iron itself. And what we do is we introduce sodium hydroxide into the mix of water that is in the tank. So it's actually soaking in this bath of 1% sodium hydroxide and water. and that's going to help pull out all of those salts. So that's another really important step. However, this is a really slow process. It's very passive. So it takes a really long time. And it's such a unique artifact that we don't actually know exactly how long it's going to take to get all of those salts out of the metal. So we just kind of have to gauge it as we go. One of the ways that we do that is we test the amount of salt in the solution over time. So eventually, the idea is once all of the salts are pulled out of the submarine itself, it'll stop introducing that salt into the solution itself. So essentially, the submarine will let us know when it's ready. But what now? So where do we go? So we have to continue. So not only are we trying to conserve the submarine itself, but all of the artifacts that are involved as well. We took off some and recovered about 4,000 individual artifacts from within and outside the Hunley itself. So we have to conserve those as well. And many of those are going to go through the exact same process as I just explained that the submarine itself goes through. Because at the end of the day, the submarine is an artifact. It's just a large artifact that's highly complex. But we have to do that with all the different artifacts, which includes things like the shoes that we recovered, and a pocket watch, and pocket knives, and canteens. All of those different materials need to be conserved, and that's what we're doing at the lab currently. All right, so the HL Hunley submarine itself. I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history of the submarine, why it's important to us, and how it came to rest out in the ocean. So for starters, the HL Hunley was built in the spring of 1863 in Mobile, Alabama. And it was built by a group of Boilermakers whose main job was to build boilers for steamships or locomotives or trains. So the Hunley is 40 feet long by 3.5 feet wide and 4 feet tall. So that's not very big. 4 feet tall, that's only, sitting down, but it's not very tall. So most of us, an adult man at the time is on average 5.5 feet tall. So they have to scrunch into this fairly tight quarters of the submarine. The majority of it, so it's made out of wrought iron plate and cast iron components. That's one of the reasons that it's such a unique conservation project, is it's made out of composite materials. So not just one material, but several, which react differently to the conservation process and the environment in which it came to rest for 134 years. One of the most interesting things about the Hunley is it was hand powered with a crew of 8 people. So it had 7 people working on a hand crank and then 1 captain. So at the time, one of the only ways to power a motor was through steam or a steam engine. That's where a lot of the steamships, how they were powered. However, you can't really have a steam engine underwater because it needs air intake and some place for that air to go. So you don't really have that option when you're underwater. So what they decided to do was power the submarine with a hand crank operated by 7 individuals that would then spin the propeller. So the engine of the Hunley is made up of people. So after it was built in 1863 in Mobile, Alabama, they had to come up with where would the Hunley be most successful in the fight against the Union. So this is during the Civil War, where you have the North and the South. And the South was blockaded all over the southern coastal states. So they decided that Charleston would be a really, really great place to try and use this submarine. So they shipped it down by rail, so on a train, to Charleston in August of 1863. So some of the important people involved in the project, one, you have Horace L. Hunley. You can see him here on the left. He was a prominent lawyer in Mobile during the time that it was built. He was a backer, so he was the financer of the Hunley, so he actually got the namesake. You also have George E. Dixon. So he was one of the builders of the submarine itself, and then went on to actually captain the submarine during its infamous run in February of 1864, but we'll get to that a little bit later. And then also you have P.T. Beauregard, who was the general of the Confederate Army in Charleston, South Carolina. So he was overseeing everything. So once the Hunley arrived in Charleston in August of 1863, P.T. Beauregard said, "Great, thank you very much. The Navy will take it from here." And he came up with a crew and just thought that all they had to do was take the Hunley out, and then they would start being successful in sinking Union ships. But this is a really complex piece of machinery. This is essentially like the spaceships of the Civil War. So nobody had really used these. It's not that this was the first submarine. Submarines had been around for a really, really long time. Very rudimentary though. And they'd even been used in war, dating back to this Revolutionary War, when someone tried to use one to sink an enemy vessel in the New York harbor. So this is a really complex piece of machinery, and P.T. Beauregard didn't fully understand that. So he developed a crew from the Navy to actually take the Hunley out, and they immediately sank it right off the dock. So that was the first time that the Hunley sank because they didn't fully understand how to operate the thing. So then Horace Hunley himself came back to Beauregard and said, "Hey, I know what I'm doing. I think I can get a crew together and I can be successful with the Hunley." He took a couple of different test runs, and unfortunately, he ended up sinking the Hunley in October 15th, 1863. So Horace Hunley actually went down with the submarine itself and unfortunately perished with his crew. And then again, after that, Beauregard basically decided this thing is too dangerous. We can't actually use it. And then that George Dixon that I mentioned earlier came to Beauregard one more time and said, "This is all human error. I know how to run this thing and I can be successful." So Beauregard said, "Okay, you can take it. However, no more diving." So how they actually overcame that is they took inspiration from a different kind of vessel. So this is the David class semi-submersible. And what they did is they put a spar-mounted torpedo, so basically an underwater mine, and put it on a long pole off the front of the vessel. And they would go up to an enemy ship, place that torpedo in place, and then detonate it as they made their escape. So the group of the Hunley said, "Okay, how about we do that? How about we place a torpedo on a spar, just like the David boat, so that way we don't actually have to submerge as often to attack the vessels." Because the idea at the beginning was they had a towed torpedo off of the back. So it'd be a long piece of rope, about 150 feet long, with a floating torpedo at the end of it. And they would go up to an enemy vessel and they would submerge like a submarine does, travel underneath of it while towing that floating torpedo. So by the time they're 150 feet away after crossing underneath, then the torpedo would make contact and detonate. However, one of the main reasons they couldn't do that anymore was because the waters in Charleston Harbor are too shallow. So there's not enough space between the sea floor and the bottom of a vessel for the submarine to safely navigate underneath. So they decided to come up with this spar-mounted torpedo design. So in 1863, Charleston was blockaded by the Union Navy. So the Union had a massive navy in comparison to the Confederate Navy. So they were able to actually set up a blockade. So a blockade is where a series or a number of vessels basically line up outside of a city or port and stop any incoming ship traffic. So essentially, they were stopping all of the merchant vessels that would typically go into Charleston to resupply the city with goods and materials that they need. So everything from food to clothing to building materials. So they stopped that and essentially trying to starve out the city of Charleston so that they would give up. So only a few brave sailors would take what is called blockade runners and attempt to sneak through this blockade. However, they weren't very successful. So the idea was to take the submarine, that Hunley submarine, and sneak out and start sinking some of these blockading ships so that they could poke a hole and allow merchant vessels to then come through and resupply Charleston. So that was the idea. So once George Dixon took over and he was successful in a lot of their training exercises, he decided on February 17th, 1864, that he was going to go sink the USS Housatonic. So the USS Housatonic was a large steam-powered vessel operated by the Union Navy. So it was about 4 miles off of Breach Inlet. So that's right around Sullivan's Island and Isle of Palms. You can see that there on the map. And then go out 4 miles to the Housatonic to sink that vessel. So once they got there, you can see here, we've been able to reconstruct the attack on the Housatonic. So they came around the bow of the vessel back to the stern. So the back of a ship's called a stern. So this stern quarter to detonate their torpedo. So they traveled along the surface. The crew members of the Housatonic could actually see the Hunley coming. At first, they thought it might actually be a porpoise or a sea turtle because all that was sticking out was the 2 conning towers of the submarine. But then they quickly realized that it was this secret weapon that the Confederacy had, known as a submarine. So they saw it coming, but it was too late. And they made their approach and they put their submarine in place and then detonated their torpedo and sank the Housatonic in a matter of minutes. However, once that occurred, the Hunley never came back. So disappeared for a very long time. So our questions as archaeologists are, well, what happened? Why did the Hunley sink? And how did the crew die? So what we do as archaeologists is essentially we are crime scene investigators. Our crime scenes, however, are just a lot older. So we use a lot of the same forensic techniques to try and piece together what actually occurred in this event. So those are the questions that we're after. So we start with trying to reconstruct what happened during the attack. And we take into consideration all sorts of things. So through our historical research, we've actually been able to determine which way the wind was blowing, because wind always has an effect on ships when they're out on the water, and as well as the tidal current. So which way the current was actually moving. And we know exactly where the Housatonic is. It's still resting at the bottom in the exact same place where it went down on the night of February 17th, 1864. So we know which way the current's going, we know which way the wind was going, and we know where the Hunley was located, although it took us a long time to find it. So the Hunley was located 1,000 feet almost due east of the Housatonic. What we don't know is how it got there. So if the tidal current is traveling in one direction and the wind is traveling in another, how may the Hunley have actually ended up in that location? Well, one idea is that when it conducted its attack, it backed away and then started traveling east with the current before it came to rest. But what we don't know is, well, why or how. So did the crew do that on purpose? I mean, they are a submarine. They know that enemy vessels are going to come check up on the ship that they just sank. So there are a lot of ship traffic going on. So did they want to go and sit at the bottom of the ocean and wait it out and wait for the current to actually turn around so that they could ride the current in? Or did something happen during the attack and incapacitate all of the crew? So we don't know that for sure, but we're trying to piece all of that together. So we look at the information we have first and then try and determine what may have happened. So one thing that we did is we wanted to understand the physics, or how the submarine actually worked. So how much water it would take to make the submarine neutrally or negatively buoyant. So what it would take to actually allow the submarine to sink. So how they actually did that is they had two what we call ballast tanks on the front and the back of the submarine. And what you would do is you would open up a valve that would let water rush into those tanks and actually make the submarine negatively buoyant so that it could dive. But those tanks are separated from the crew compartment, so there's not water going into the entire thing, just sections of it. So it would take a total weight. So the total weight of the submarine when it departed the dock is about 21,571 pounds. And then to actually allow it to dive, you needed to fill the forward ballast tank about 75% of its capacity and about 45% of the back ballast tank capacity, and that would allow it to actually become neutrally and then negatively buoyant. The submarine could travel at about 1 knot or 1 mile per hour at a cruising speed. So that's pretty slow. Remember, I said that the Housatonic was 4 miles from shore. So if it's traveling at 1 mile an hour and it has to go 4 miles, that's going to take about 4 hours to actually get there. So it took 4 hours before the attack actually commenced. And then the submarine could travel at about 3 knots or about 3 miles an hour at a sprint. So short distances, it could travel at about 3 miles an hour. Still not very fast. So we know that the Hunley ended up 1,000 feet away from the Housatonic, but we again don't exactly know how it got there. So we come up with a couple of theories. Well, if during the attack, was there some sort of break in the submarine that allowed water to rush in and sink it? And if so, how much water would it actually take to sink the submarine and they wouldn't be able to actually resurface? So we conducted a couple of different studies, and we were able to determine or calculate that somewhere between 50 and 75 gallons would have to come into the submarine to overwhelm it with its reserve buoyancy in the hatches in the snorkel box. So that would take 75 additional gallons of water to sink the submarine. Okay, well, how long would it take 75 gallons to actually get inside the submarine based off of some of the holes that we have in the submarine itself? Well, we were able to determine that it would take about 5 minutes for that much water to actually enter the submarine. So if that was the case, so you have 5 minutes of water rushing into the submarine, how far could it actually have traveled based off of the wind and the current and the submarine's ability to move? Well, we were able to determine again that it would have only been able to travel about 430 feet from the Housatonic. Well, it moved 1,000 feet. So that kind of indicates to us that perhaps that's not what happened. Perhaps it wasn't that sort of sinking event. So you can see here, this is the 430 foot mark. So it traveled over twice that distance. So that kind of indicates that that is probably not what actually ended up sinking the Hunley itself. So what else may have done it? Well, what if it was the explosion? Could the explosion actually have incapacitated or killed the crew during the attack? Well, we've run some experiments again to try and test that. We ran those in 2016. So you'll notice here in the diagram that the Hunley was only about 16 feet away from the explosion when it occurred. So the torpedo was never detached from the spar when it was detonated. So it maintained that distance of 16 feet from the explosion. Well, that's pretty close. So we want to know what that explosion could have done to the crew, and if that explosion could have actually incapacitated them or killed them. So we ran a study and we tested the torpedo or something similar to the torpedo with the Navy, as well as a special group from Michigan University, to test the strength of that explosion. So with our 135-pound black powder torpedo, what we were able to determine is, well, black powder isn't quite like TNT like we know today. It's not a high explosive. It's actually a little bit of a slower burn. So it turns into more of a pressure wave than a shock wave. So based off of that study, so actually detonating a 135-pound black powder torpedo and studying the explosion itself, we were able to determine that it would actually be closer to a pressure wave from that torpedo onto the submarine. So it would have actually been rather modest. It would have caused no structural damage to the submarine itself. And really all it would have done is kind of cause a heaving motion to the submarine itself. So when the torpedo exploded and it sent that pressure out, most of it is actually going to be focused upwards. So you can see that here. So that's based off of the water pressure. So in the water, so underneath, a lot of that pressure is going to actually want to go straight up rather than out. And that's because water is more dense than air. So a lot of that pressure actually would have either gone down into the ocean floor or directly up, which is actually one of the reasons that the torpedo was so successful in sinking the Housatonic, is it traveled almost directly up into the Housatonic itself, so into the hull of that ship. But that would have also bounced down and came back up into the torpedo. So it actually would have caused more of a heaving motion. Because one of the unique things about the Hunley itself is that it has a really sharp bow or front. So the very front of the submarine is really sharp. It's almost like a blade. So a lot of that pressure actually would have rippled off and the submarine would have cut through that pressure wave actually very effectively. So it indicated that there was no direct injury to the crew of the Hunley based off of the explosion. So we were able to determine that it was highly unlikely that the explosion itself would have actually caused any physical harm to the crew members themselves. And we've also studied hundreds and hundreds of other accounts of underwater explosions throughout different wars, including World War I and World War II, and how underwater mines and explosions actually affect people in submarines based off of those explosions. And we have hundreds of accounts of submariners surviving much larger explosions with higher amounts of shock wave in a closer capacity than those of the Hunley. So we're fairly positive that the explosion itself did not actually harm the crew. So what else could have done it? Well, after we deconcreted the hull, we were able to see a lot more of the metal itself and evaluate what kind of damage may have occurred that could have affected the crew and the sinking event. So a couple of different areas of hull damage. So we actually have a couple of really large sections where there are holes in the submarine itself. So when we first saw those, we were thinking, oh, wow, those are massive. They would have easily caused the submarine to sink and sink rather quickly. How did these happen? But through studying the vessel, we were actually able to determine that those holes were caused by scouring and corrosion. So when the submarine sat on the sea floor, it was resting slightly on its side, and that sea current would have had sand traveling alongside the submarine itself, almost acting like a power sander to the side of the submarine itself. And that's actually what caused these holes and this damage. So this didn't actually occur during the attack, but actually after it sank, over its long lifetime of sitting on the ocean floor. So that's actually how those occurred. You can kind of see those pieces of damage in those photos there. So some additional damage that we have is in this forward conning tower. So this hatch that they actually would have been like, that's what they would have used to get in and out of the submarine. This is the very forward one, so the front one. They had these portholes, so these little glass viewports that they could see out of. So you'd stick your head up into the conning tower and be able to see out of the submarine. So we had a little bit of damage that you can see here. Well, what would have caused that? Well, the crew members of the Housatonic did actually fire on the submarine itself using pistols and rifles and shotguns. So we wanted to know if those weapons could have actually caused that damage. So what we did is we reconstructed the forward conning tower using the same materials, so cast iron, and we fired period weapons on that reconstruction to see if that's what actually would have happened. So we took rifles from 1863 and shotguns, and we shot at this reconstructed conning tower. And what we were able to determine is none of those weapons could have actually caused that level of damage. And one of the other interesting things is we found all of the crew members in their exact location after excavating the submarine. So it appears that there was no panic on board. So if water was rushing in, you would think that, well, somebody would have tried to at least get out or scramble to one of the conning towers, and that wasn't the case. So again, there was one other piece of damage that may have caused the sinking, or at least allowed enough water to come into the submarine. So that's so it's an intake valve, which we found broken. So this may have allowed water to come in. However, it wouldn't have occurred in the way that we determined earlier, where it would have taken 5 minutes and the Hunley would have only been able to travel 430 feet. So we think that this, again, may not have been the case, or one of the things that caused water to come in. Also, we always go back to the fact that the crew never moved out of their battle stations, essentially. So some of the additional hull damage on the Hunley submarine. So that forward spar has a boom on it, so a wooden stick that would have actually held the spar up. You can see that it caused damage here where the would have actually broken off. So those flanges, or those brackets that held that in place, you can see where those were actually bent on the submarine itself. And we found all of those pieces. So we think that that probably occurred through collision. So when the submarine came in contact and placed its torpedo on the Housatonic, it may have actually used that boom, or that wooden stick, as a bumper. So as soon as that would have actually come in contact, they would have known that they were in place. So we have evidence of that collision on the Hunley itself. So you can see that here in our reconstruction. So kind of in conclusion of what we think may have happened to this to the Hunley? Well, we have some collision damage. We can see that clearly. We have tried to reconstruct if gunfire could have actually caused some of the damage. We don't believe that it could have through our experimental archaeology. And then finally, the sinking path does not actually reach the Hunley's location. So after going through all of this, we are still trying to determine what actually happened to the submarine. We don't have all of the answers yet. So a couple of different theories that may have happened. So as archaeologists, we never want to say exactly, we can't actually determine without all of the evidence what actually happened. So we have theories instead. So we are not conclusive necessarily. So one of the things that may have occurred is, like I mentioned earlier, the crew of the Hunley may have said, well, how about we go and we sit at the bottom? So they traveled out of the danger zone and sat down at the bottom and actually tried to wait out all of the incoming traffic and boat traffic and wait for the tide to turn. Well, they only have a limited amount of air inside the submarine, because the only air that's in there is what they take with them. So eventually, if we breathe all of that oxygen, it's actually going to deplete or go down, and then the crew wouldn't have enough oxygen to breathe. They would also expel carbon dioxide into the submarine. And all of those things could actually cause the crew to essentially fall asleep. They would have also been extremely exhausted from the attack itself, as well as the travel out there to the Housatonic. As I mentioned earlier, it was 4 miles away. It would have taken them almost 4 hours to get there. So that's a little bit of information about the history of the Hunley itself. How much do I have till 12 o'clock?
Absolutely.
All right, fantastic. I'll keep going. I'll try and save a little bit of time at the end for anybody who has any questions. So I'm going to try and get through a little bit of the archaeology that we've conducted in examining all of the different aspects of the Hunley itself. So one of the things that we do is we study the geology of the site. So the sand and sediment surrounding the site. So by doing that, we've actually determined that it was likely buried in about 15 to 20 years, and it was not disturbed for over 100 years after it sank. So we know that nobody actually located the submarine until it was discovered in 1995. Some of the stuff that we do, we focus really heavily on 3D documentation and modeling. So this is a big push in archaeology today, is using everything from laser scanners to photographs to digitally document and create 3D models of the Hunley and all of its artifacts, and then the crew itself. So one of the big things about excavating the crew or the Hunley is there were 8 men still on board when we recovered the submarine. So we have to pay respect to those who died on the submarine. So that was a big push for us. So we actually excavated all of the crew members. We documented and digitally recreated all of the bones. And then we had an osteologist who came in and studied the bones as well and was able to determine things like age and height, and what some of the different conditions of the crew member. So we found like no broken bones or anything like that that may have occurred during the attack. Again, through that osteological examination, we were able to determine where everyone was. So again, it appears that everyone maintained a position in their battle station. So along with the osteology, we also did a genealogical study to try and figure out who these crew members were. And through that genealogical study, we were able to determine each one of the crew members, because at the end of the day, that's what this is about. We are trying to figure out who these people were, why they were doing this incredibly dangerous and brave thing, and how they did it. So one of the ways, again, is through the deconcretion of the interior. This kind of just shows some of the before and after and how difficult some of this work actually is. So when our conservation team has to go and physically remove that concretion layer, they have to get inside the Hunley submarine. And you can see here in the middle picture, that's a really tight fit. So we give it up to our conservation team for their incredibly hard work in doing this in pretty difficult environment. So also, again, looking at the 3D documentation, this is a big push for us. Right here, this is what we call photogrammetry. So this is actually using a camera and photographs, or a series of photographs that you can then plug into a program called PhotoScan and create a 3D model. So we can actually do that through photographs. So this is a fairly new technology. It's up and coming. And it's been very, very useful because now we can take models and then study them a little better on our computer rather than having to actually get inside the submarine every time to look at different components. And we can also digitally document the conservation phases. So what it looks like before and after conservation. So here's an image of the crew compartment. This is the back of the submarine. So this is the engineer's quarters. This is the gearing mechanism of the Hunley itself. So once we deconcreted it and we documented everything, we were able to determine how the gearing mechanism actually worked. So one of the things that you'll notice is that, I don't know if, can you see my mouse? Okay, so you can see here, these are the two different gears. You'll notice that one of them is larger than the other one. So this one here, actually, the one on the left, actually connects to the hand crank. And then this goes all the way back to the propeller itself. So you'll notice that these are two different sizes. Well, this is exactly how the gears work on your bicycle. So it's the same sort of principle used on your bicycle to create more RPMs, or reps per minute. One of the other things that is involved is this flywheel. So this is a large, heavy cast iron wheel that once the hand crank gets moving, it actually creates momentum that makes it easier on the crew to propel the submarine. Here is the Dixon station. So this is the pilot station. You can see the whip staff, or the rudder staff. This is actually what he would have used to control which way the Hunley was moving, like where the submarine was going to go. It's kind of like a joystick. And then a couple of the interesting pieces that we found. Here is an unknown lever, essentially. We don't actually know what it was used for. A couple of theories is that it helped latch the conning tower down. But it also may have been a part of the weapon system to actually activate the torpedo. So a little bit more on that, because the idea is that it may have been actually attached with a lanyard, and all you would do is you'd pull on that and it would activate the torpedo. And then I want to leave you with a fun story that has been going around for a long time about the crew members of, or at least one crew member of the Hunley. So George Dixon, kind of an infamous character. And for the longest time, prior to the recovery of the Hunley, there was this story that went around about George Dixon and his famous gold coin that saved his life. And part of the story was that his sweetheart, Queenie Bennett, gave it to him, and that's what saved his life. However, this was just a part of the myth of the Hunley and its crew members. We unfortunately were able to determine that He never actually would have received it from anyone named Queenie. He's never mentioned her by name. But we do have the gold coin that saved his life. So that's one of the things that we actually found on the Hunley itself, is that gold coin. And it has an inscription on it that talks about how it saved his life. It was his lucky gold coin. He had it on him in the Battle of Shiloh. And when he got shot, the gold coin actually took on most of the impact of that bullet. So anyway, that's all I have for you. I think we have a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask any. I know I went through a lot. It's a lot of information. I went through it pretty fast, but.
Okay, so I'm gonna ask a question. I'm Maddox. I'm a historic preservation major and archaeology major at College of Charleston.
Great.
I don't know a lot about the Hunley, but I am wondering how they did find it in the 90s, because it is pretty shallow, so they can't use like side scan sonar or an ROV or AUV. So how did they locate the Hunley?
That's a great question. How did we locate the Hunley? So it was located in 1995, but they looked for it for years over several different projects. So what they ended up using is, so it was located in about 30 feet of water, and they used a marine magnetometer, which is essentially just a really, really large, fancy metal detector, and they towed that off of the back of a boat. You can use side scan sonar in that environment. It is deep enough to use that. However, they knew that the submarine was most likely buried, so you wouldn't actually be able to image or view the submarine. So the best thing that they could use was a magnetometer or a big metal detector, and that's actually how they found it. And then once they, found an anomaly large enough to fit the profile of the submarine, they went and dove on it, and that's how they found it.
That's awesome. Pretty cool.
Any other questions?
Hey, can y'all hear me?
Yep.
Nick, hey, thank you so much for today.
You got it.
So they found it in 95 and they didn't raise it until years later. How much time passed between the time when they discovered it and the time that they brought it up?
Very good question. So found in 1995, and they didn't actually bring it up or recover it until 2000. So one of the things about archaeology is you always want to have a plan for conservation. So you never want to just bring anything up to bring it up. You always want to have a big plan. So they spent those 5 years trying to determine where the Hunley was going to go, who was actually going to conserve it, and how long that may take. So there was a lot of planning that went into, a lot of foresight that went into that during that 5-year period, as well as the actual excavation itself, which took a long time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nick, that may be it. Yeah,
All right.
The presentation was so comprehensive, I think. That was really fabulous, because our school went there a couple of years ago. We've been a couple of times, but that's powerful background for going to see it, which we should all do when the COVID-19 ends, is head up to North Charleston and go to the Warren Lasch Center and see all this in person.
Absolutely. So we hold tours on Saturdays and Sundays, and they are led by a fantastic group of volunteers that are very, very knowledgeable on the submarine itself and the history and the crew. And the Friends of the Hunley, which is in charge of the museum side of things, they have put together a fantastic exhibit going over the history, the excavation, and all of the different aspects of the Hunley. So please come check it out. Again, Saturdays and Sundays, once everybody's allowed to go back outside.
So thank
Cool.
you.
Well,
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks to you and Clemson and the Charleston Area Convention Center and Visitors Bureau for allowing us to do this, and for bringing some great programming during spring break. So Nick, many thanks. Take care. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, thank you very much.